Monika is the Octopus visual field expert at Haag-Streit and is responsible for all market and customer-oriented visual field activities globally. She is a Master of Science in Biotechnology from the Swiss Federal Institute of Science and Technology and a Master of Advanced Studies in Marketing Management at the University of Basel. Prior to joining Haag-Streit Diagnostic, Monika worked in trauma product management at Diffuse and dental impact product management at Straumann.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the introduction, Wayne, and thank you for taking the time to attend this webinar. I will go through in the next hour for a couple of points where I feel I can really advance your visual field interpretation skills if we look at them on how to make the most of all the representations that the Octopus offers. I will start with common representations because there's some tips and tricks there. We'll show you the benefits of the cluster and polar analysis, especially in early borderline cases, and then focus for at least half of the talk on the progression analysis and how you can be really fast and effective by using it. Let's dive right into how to interpret a single field. What I found, it makes really sense to kind of follow a systematic approach whenever to do it and start with simple things like check the patient information. Ask yourself, can I trust this field before you actually go into analysis? Then take the time to ask yourself whether it's actually normal or abnormal. In borderline cases, that's not so easy. And only then jump to what kind of disease could this actually be and how bad is it, to then really base your clinical decision on this. I just give you a couple of tips and tricks on things I think that maybe sometimes forgotten or not paid so much attention to. This is not a whole beginner's curriculum. One of the things I find where sometimes people go wrong is that they have incorrect refraction, and then that leads to an artificial diffuse loss. Here, just an example on the left, correct age, and then you see how the field changes. Well, this is an age example, but it would be same with wrong refraction, how the field actually changes based on that. Couple of things to always check. First one, I think, is what everyone does, check the false positive and negative answers. But it's actually more signs of unreliable fields that we sometimes miss. Check for edge and rim artifacts, check for ptosis. Here are some examples. And one I find quite important is the consistency of results with further diagnostic tests. So does it make sense from your whole clinical point of view? But also, are the fields repeatable or not? If you have them, observations of a visual field examiner can be really helpful. Something like patient was really nervous today, patient hadn't slept well, and then you get a really strange field, and I would tell you something. And the defect curve, I'll get to that, will also give you hints at an unreliable field. Just to get back to the point I find is not always looked at so much is the consistency of fields. Here's a series of fields for more superior nasal defects. While there's some variability in the performance, clearly the defect is where it's supposed to be. It's repeatable. It's a shape typical for pathology. And if we had other diagnostic methods that confirm the pathology, we can really say this is a reliable field where the defect is where it should be. On the other hand, untrustworthy fields are inconsistent. So key thing, if in doubt, just repeat the test. And you see here something very common, learning effect on the first field, typical rim artifact showing up at the edges, jumping around. They should really be ignored because they're not a defect, just an unreliable result. Then another thing to pay attention to, and the Octopus has a really nice tool to do that, is diffuse loss. Just as this definition, diffuse loss is something like this, where the loss is spread out across the fields, contrary to local loss, where it's a specific location. And of course, there's some pathology, anything interior jamb, or lens opacities, cornea opacities, then switcher's opacity gives a diffuse loss. Typically, you would know about them from your other diagnostic results. But what if you don't find such a disease and you find diffuse loss? Then it's actually quite a strong sign that there's something wrong with the quality of the field test, because there's a lot of kind of errors in the test that lead to diffuse loss, being it incorrect refraction, incorrect patient age, small pupil size, but also all these psychological effects, learning effects, distraction, fixation loss, fatigue. They all give you a diffuse loss. And typically we perform visual field testing to kind of find diseases given more localized defects like glaucoma, neuro diseases. And of course, rim and lid artifacts would also be local. But it's really those here that we can find out when we see diffuse loss. And the Octopus makes it really easy to detect diffuse loss because it really takes you 1 second to look at the defect curve and you find the diffuse loss very easily. Let's just have a look at this movie on how it works. You see, this is the comparison chart where we show the defect, and we just line them up independent on where they come from. It's really simple maths, and we draw this curve. Now, what makes this so powerful? It's a really easy graphical thing to look at. So as long as the curve is in its normal band, it's normal. Diffuse loss are characterized by a parallel downward shift from normalized, whereas the local loss shows a drop at the right-hand side. And of course, you can have a combination of diffuse and local loss, which would look like this. And you see, it takes you less than 1 second to identify, hey, there's diffuse loss. And again, here are the two examples. On the left, just diffuse loss. On the right, a combination of diffuse and local loss. And really, the way to go about this is if you find the diffuse loss, ask yourself, is there any pathology with this diffuse loss related to it? If there's not, this is clearly a sign of an unreliable field. And the defect curve is useful also to identify trigger-happy patients. These are these patients that just keep clicking no matter what, either because they fake it or because they get into a rhythm. They, with the dynamic strategy, they overshoot on the left. If you see this, clear sign of a trigger-happy patient typically comes along with high false positive rates. Good, let's move on then. Once we've established the field is normal or is reliable, and only reliable for fields are worth looking at, we have to ask yourself, is this actually normal or not? And it seems like an easy question, but it's, I think, the most difficult ones when it comes to visual field interpretation. We've had the probabilities plots for decades, and our competitors had too, but I still find it's a bit hard to interpret. Here's some aid. You look at this graphically, and if you just see these small insignificant dots, this is a likely normal location. And if it gets darker, it's a likely abnormal location. And what's important to understand, we don't need this if something is either clearly normal, like here on the left, or clearly abnormal with a large defect, if this is a reliable field. Then we don't even need to look at it. But in borderline cases, this is the one representation to look at. And let me give you some examples and also how to interpret that. You know, everyone is allowed 1 or 2 or 3 mistakes in life. And so are the patients who are doing visual field tests. So if you just get 1, 2, 3, 4 abnormal locations, that's pretty normal. That can happen to anybody. And as long as they're kind of randomly distributed somewhere and show no characteristic pattern of a pathology, we still say this is a normal field. But where it gets really abnormal is if the same abnormal locations cluster in test locations consistent with a pathology. Let me give you some examples, and that's why I really advise to look at the probabilities and not at the kind of more intuitive to read grayscale representation in borderline cases. You see the grayscale, right? Kind of just what have we lost, and you get some numbers, some colors, and yes, there's something, but how strong is this really? Now let's look at the probabilities where we're really looking at statistical normality or abnormality. What do we see here? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, actually 5 likely abnormal locations, but they're totally randomly dispersed. So we still consider that as normal. Same with this one here. It's a bit too little to be a significant thing, unless it's consistent, and then maybe a beginning percentile or arcade defect. And just have a look again here at a grayscale. Now let's look at the other cases. I mean, they're very similar, very, very similar. So in borderline cases, the grayscale is really of not that much use. But now let's have a look at the probabilities. This patient here has a partial arcuate inferior defect. This patient here has a partial superior arcuate and an inferior paracentral. Clearly, this cluster together, random mistakes don't happen like this. So this is what we call an abnormal case. And it's really this way of looking at things that should make it really easy. And if you see something borderline, don't look at the grayscale in the first place because it's misleading. Then, of course, when it just comes to assessing shape and depth of defect, the grayscale comparison is great. The comparison is great for the depth. Here's just for the shape. Just a word of caution. This is an interpolated map. We have with the GP out of 59 test locations. So actually our resolution is like here on the right. So if you see one little pixel moving up or down or something, don't overinterpret that as a change. It really, this is your resolution and that's what you get. Just keep that in mind. And then at the end of your analysis, look at the mean defect, just as the severity. The mean defect is the average of the whole defect. You see here a normal field, here a very advanced disease, and you see how the mean defect, the MD, just increases in decibel. And really, I would advise to look at this in the end, not in the beginning. You will not be able to define the very subtle early local loss just by looking at the MD because it would be too small because it's an average. Here, really, the probabilities representation is great. But of course, when it comes to classification, severity, this is a great help. And the last one, the square root loss of variance, is also a helpful tool, more to characterize the field and distinguish between diffuse and localized loss, especially if you have to describe it to somebody. If you have a statistics degree, the SLV is really the standard deviation of the MD. If you don't have a statistics degree like myself, let's look at this a bit more graphically. It really answers the question, how much do individual defects differ from the MD? Because you see, this field has an MD of 6.3, this has an MD of 6.5. So it's pretty much the same. Because here you have a very deep defect on the right, but nothing else there, whereas here you have a widespread diffuse loss, but a much smaller one. And that's what the SLV does. It kind of says, like, how much do these individual locations spread out from the average? And the larger the spread, the larger the SLV. And it kind of is a measure for diffuse defects have a small SLV and local defects have a large SLV. Some people say the SLV is kind of a more earlier sign for a change or abnormality because it reacts a bit earlier than the MD. And this was very brief because I think most of this is known. I just wanted to highlight a couple of points. When it comes to visual field interpretation, as I said, first question always look at whether you can actually trust the field. Then ask yourself whether it's normal or abnormal, especially in borderline cases. Think about what kind of disease it could be and how bad this is.
Monica, we have one question, if you have a second.
Sure. Yeah.
It says the defect curve seems interesting. Is it printed out on a printout from the Octopus?
Yes, it is. It is on the 7-in-1 standard printout, but you can also, the Octopus allows you to customize your own format, so you can put it on any format you want to, really. But it is on the standard printout.
Great, thank you very much.
You're welcome. I'm at the end of the first section, so I think it'll be a good pause point for other questions. If somebody has them.
Any other questions, just type them through to me. Otherwise, we can move forward. It looks like that's it.
Okay, let's move forward then. I'd like to show you two things which are unique to the Octopus, which are the cluster and the polar analysis. They're really helpful tools in borderline early glaucoma cases. So let me show you what they are first, and then I'll show you how to read them. So what is the cluster analysis? What we basically do is we take the comparisons representations that we have, the defect size at different locations, and then we cluster them in 10 clusters following retinal nerve fiber distribution. And what we do, out of that cluster, we take all these individual defects and we make an average, a cluster mean defect. And then we use a similar representation as on the probabilities plot. Basically, a plus means it's fairly normal, and if you get a number, the newest alpha version that comes also with an orange and a red color code, that means actually it's a likely abnormal cluster. You see an example here. I said if you get a plus, that's a likely normal cluster, and if you get these colors, that's quite a highly likely abnormal cluster. So now let me illustrate why this is cool. The cluster analysis has actually been proven by a number of studies to be the most sensitive tool to detect early subtle glaucoma. And let me explain you why. When we look at the probabilities representation, right? This case here, we get two subtle points just up here. It's not free, they're very subtle, potentially abnormal, could just be random. How do we interpret that, right? Because the whole rest looks clear. But then we take the cluster analysis and it becomes crystal clear. This area here is abnormal. And why does that work? The problem is when we look at single points, the normal fluctuation is huge because perimetry is a very hard test for patients. So there's a lot of variability. So the normal boundaries are huge, and it really takes kind of a huge type of defect, something of 4 or 5 decibel in the center, to really flag it as abnormal. And when you look about the MD is cool because it averages and gets rid of all that fluctuation. But the problem is the MD is like a global thing, and glaucoma starts locally. So really, the cluster analysis kind of gets the best of the two worlds. It averages, but it averages locally. And that's why the normal ranges are so much smaller than single points that actually flags things. And how to read that? It's really, if you suspect glaucoma, but the case is borderline, look at the cluster analysis. And if the cluster analysis picks it up as well, it's really there. If not, maybe not, or maybe then you see the confirmation in your other diagnostic result. A second really useful tool for the same purpose to identify glaucoma is the polar analysis. And the polar analysis is there to answer the question, where should you look for a corresponding structural defect? Because right in the beginning, they're very subtle, so they may be hard to see. It's nice to have a little pointer. And for that, we developed the polar analysis. What the polar analysis does is we take the local defects and we project them along the nerve fibers to the optic disc, because we know which defects goes onto which fiber and where that enters the optic disc. And then we draw this polar analysis chart. The length is just the defect size, and we flip it to be oriented exactly like a structural result. So what we do is we have a visual field result, but we project it in a way that it looks like a structural result. And then you can just do an easy side-by-side comparison. Let me just go back to the initial case I showed you before. Right, so here's the grayscale of comparisons, here's the probabilities. Something very subtle here, but maybe it's just random. The cluster analysis confirms the superior arcuate defect. And now look at the polar analysis. And the polar analysis shows that the corresponding structural location shows exactly that type of defect, whereas the whole rest of the field looks very normal. It's that spike. You see that spike, it kind of tells you, okay, where should I look for structural defect? And that will be here at 7 o'clock position, or here in the macula map. And you find the correspondence, and obviously that's a very strong indicator of glaucoma. So here's just some more cases for yourself to familiarize yourself a bit with the idea. So here, paracentral defect, cluster and superior. Of course, the cluster analysis picks it up. The polar analysis shows the corresponding defect, just flipped. And then when you look at the structure results, you see exactly the same thing. These are really powerful tools for glaucoma, and they're readily available in any Octopus. Are there any questions on these two things, on the cluster and the polar analysis?
So there's been a couple of questions that have come through. One of them was, can we get these slides as a resource to refer back to? And I was just actually typing back and saying that we're recording the webinar and we'll be posting it. So if you want to come back and reference that, you can. Also, at the end in the survey, one of the questions is, would you like a digital copy of the Visual Field Digest? And if you choose yes, then we'll email it out to you, a link where you can go and download the digest, and that has all this information and more if you ever need to reference that. So that was the first question. The second question was, did I understand that right, that the cluster analysis is more sensitive than the just looking at the probabilities?
Yes, you're right. And as I explained, this is because we get rid of a lot of this normal fluctuation, this noise that typically masks subtle defect if we just look at it point by point. And that's the reason why this is more sensitive. And there's been now 5, 6, 7 studies on this, repeatedly proving it. There's also a cluster trend analysis where we get to later, and it's the same thing. This is out in the market, the most sensitive tool to detect glaucoma.
Okay, one other question. This sounds like it's from somebody who has an Octopus. Has there been a consideration to flip the cluster analysis so it's similar to the polar analysis and it's more anatomically aligned?
Can you repeat that? I think I didn't quite understand the question.
So actually, I understand. I'll sort of say it in a little different way. That the cluster analysis is showing you where the defect is on the visual field, but it doesn't relate to the anatomy because it's inverted. The polar trend, it's flipped so that it aligns, it corresponds well with the anatomy. Is there thought about doing that with the cluster analysis?
Well, I mean, there's thought, but it's kind of a debate, right? Because it's still, some people are used to look at it the visual field way, and it's a visual field, and I think it would harden the link to the probabilities, and all these in a grayscale if suddenly the cluster analysis was flipped.
Okay.
So obviously, technically, it would be easy to do, but we haven't. I mean, there's pros and cons for that.
Okay, it was just a question. Thank you. Those were the end of the question. If anyone else has questions, please just type them through to me, and I'll ask them the next opportunity we get. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, let's move on to the progression analysis. I don't know how many of you use one or how many of you look at more seal reviews, but no matter what, I guess we all know assessing visual field change is quite challenging. We're looking at different series, especially if progression is not that fast, especially if patients are not that consistent. It gets very hard, and it gets very hard looking at serial reviews. And studies on expert agreements on progression are actually very discouraging. I mean, they say expert agreement is something between 45 and 65%. But what these studies also say that if you use a progression software, you can actually increase agreement and consistency in interpretation. So this is really a plus, and it says like by 10, 20%. It's still a hard problem, but it helps. So that's why the Octopus offers you a whole tool set to look at visual field progression, and it may be overwhelming at first. So we go through this step by step. The series of visual fields, of course, that tells you where the defect is and the depth, and just gives you a very quick, at a glance overview. Then we're looking at mean defect progression. Is there real change or just fluctuation? We look at local and diffuse change, and I'll get to that on why this is helpful. And we look at cluster change, and also with the cluster trend analysis, and with the polar trend analysis, we can look at where to look for structural change. So let's start with question number 1. Do we actually have real change or just fluctuation? And I will set this up starting from the beginning on how a trend analysis works. This is something very statistical. Not everyone has a statistics degree. So let's start from the beginning. What we want to see is overall, is the visual field getting worse or not, or is it stable? And we use for that the mean defect, which summarizes the visual field really in a few words. You can use to assess disease severity. You see here progressing visual field defect, and that's the mean defect going along. And it's been really proven over the years to be very robust measure of change. And there's been a lot of other things tried, but this still comes out very strong. So now, how do we do trend analysis? So we take the first visual field test, which was in 2002 in this example, and we plot the MD just here. And then we do it with all subsequent tests that we have, and we get this plot. And what we then do is we draw this trend line, the red line. And the trend line is really something, think about it. You just see all these little squares, and somebody asks you, hey, draw a line that best connects all these squares. And you would come up with something similar to this. And interpretation then would also not be that hard, right? I mean, if the line's straight, we would say, well, okay, this is stable. If it's going down, that's worsening. And if it's going up, that's improving. So if change is large enough, it's actually quite easy to interpret. And then what we also do, if we have this trend line, and that's where it gets also interesting, is we can measure something called slope. Slope is really like how fast, like clinically what it means, how fast does this change? And we take this line and we just say, okay, in 1 year, how many decibel does this change, right? So this is 1 year. In 1 year, this will 1.9 decibel down. So that's the speed of change. So the slope is the speed of the change. And that's really important, of course, for you to make a treatment decision related to patient's age, life expectancy, already a loss on, speed of change. How aggressively do you need to treat? And the simple method of just drawing the trend line based on your vision works reasonably well, but of course there's statistics. There's methods of doing that, and they're slightly more accurate. Because it's, the challenge is sometimes it's not just the speed, the slope, but also the outliers. This patient's much less consistent than that patient. So here it's much harder to draw that line than it is here, right? And statistics take this into account, and then actually tells you, okay, based on what I have, how sure am I that this is really change or not? And only when the statistics is sure, you actually get a red downward symbol saying, this, I'm pretty sure, is not stable. This is worsening. So the only thing you really have to do is look at these symbols. And if you get a red downward arrow, that's likely worsening. If you get no symbol, it's stable. Sometimes you get improvement, not so often. And there's 2 degrees of severity. So the cookbook for this interpretation, it's a huge chart and there's a whole lot of things, but there's only 2 things to do. First one, do I have a red symbol going down here? Yes. Okay, that's real change, worsening in that case. And how fast is the change? And I look at the slope and I know speed, and then I can make a treatment decision. So this is a really fast and helpful tool to answer a very difficult question about real change. Now, I'll just give you some examples on where to be cautious. The statistics are, as I showed you before in the graphics, they're a bit better than just human interpretation of a series of fields, but they're not perfect. And let me show you factors that actually influence change. The analysis. One is if you don't have enough tests and you have a lot of fluctuation, as in this case, the statistics just doesn't know for sure. You know, I mean, this may be real and this may be not real. Like, how do we know, right? So in this case, we need more tests for the change to become really significant, to be really sure this is change. And I think that's a key thing. If it's important for your decision making to get really good data, do more visual field testings. I mean, that's where all this recommendation on do 6 fields in the first 2 years come from. Get more data points, so get rid of the fluctuation. And obviously, and I think that's the next example, the more fluctuation you have, the more inconsistent your patients are, the longer it takes you to detect change. I mean, you see here a quite fast progression, but yet you have outliers. As I said, after 6 fields, there's not picking up the change, whereas if you have a much more consistent patient and actually a much smaller change, statistics are already picking up. And here, it's really recommended to invest in the quality of the visual field testing, train your technicians, train them well. Innova is very happy to help you with that, because that makes a huge difference to the results you get. It's patients that need to perform well, needs to understand the task. And then the first thing is, as I said, fluctuation is really bad. And here's an example going to the extreme, but it's actually a real example. You know, when you get a lot of unreliable, untrusted fields, this completely destroys your trend analysis. So you have to exclude that. Here you have a ptosis artifact, so obviously the MD is really bad. Here you have very high false positive rates. These are these two. So they're not real. They're way too good for that patient. And if we keep them in, this series looks actually like improving, but you see how defects are really jumping around. So if we get rid of the ptosis artifact, this looks like stable. And then if we actually also get rid of the high false positives, then suddenly we see reality of a truly worsening visual field series. And this is really nice what you can do with the EyeSuite software that comes with every Octopus, because you can just, with a simple click, add or remove fields from analysis. You see how we click here on fields and we just add them, and they automatically, instantaneously changes the analysis. It is not something, if you have your Octopus connected, then you can look at that in your office. It's nothing you need to ask your technician to do, or it gets very tricky. It's just a click, and you can always undo it, so you can really play around with the data. And I recommend you to do that if you see unreliable fields. With a newer version, you can also permanently exclude a field. I mean, if you deem something as totally unreliable, then you don't need to revisit that choice again. You can just save that. Okay.
I've got another question for you, if you
Sure.
can. The normal values for MD, SLV, do we go by the figures on the machine? So does it present the normal values for those, or does it?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't look for normal values when it. I mean, we do have normal values for the MD, and if you look at a single MD, and it goes beyond the normal ranges, you get an orange and a red color code saying it's outside of normal ranges in the newer software version, or else it tells you, okay, this is going out of normal ranges. But on the trend analysis, this is not relevant. What we're looking at is how likely is that kind of change happening in a stable series. And we use statistics to do that. And if it deviates too much from a stable trend, then we say this is progressing.
Okay, and there's another question here. The arrows, the unfilled and the filled arrows, that's 95% and 99%?
Yes,
And
exactly.
do you take them as being equal, or how do you gauge a unfilled arrow versus a filled arrow?
Okay, so obviously statistics, statistics are never 100% perfect, but a filled arrow means like out of 100 field zeros, it makes one mistake, kind of assuming something to be progressing where it's actually not. So this is a very strong message. And the unfilled is just a little bit a weaker message. So, but it really depends. You may have patients that are very slowly progressing, and then an unfilled is a strong message, especially if you have just a few fields. If you have a very fast progressor, it should fill quite quickly. But obviously, filled is a higher level of certainty.
Okay, good. Those are the questions. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, let's move on. Some other nice things you got that are really helpful in some situations is call you identify change, but why is it there? Do we know? And it's really nice to look at local versus diffuse change. Here just to revisit a slide I've shown before, kind of saying, well, local change is often, glaucoma, which is what we most often look for a progression, is typically a local change. But we do have some pathologies, most common cataract, that is diffuse. And of course, a patient may have both diseases. Or you may have an unreliable field with an additional diffuse loss. So how to distinguish between these? Let me just show you some cases to make the point. As I said, most common combination of overlapping fields, because you can have overlapping visual field defects based on two eye diseases, so patients with glaucoma and cataract. And you see this series and it's obviously progressing. But why? Is it glaucoma? Is it the cataract? Because they're adding to each other. And this is pretty kind of a strong progression on the local side. So probably would say that glaucoma is progressing, but still, we know that it is progressing, but we don't necessarily know why. And the other situation where this becomes really helpful is, as I said, if we get a lot of fluctuation and a lot of this unreliable responses as diffuse results in diffuse artifacts, then this may mask subtle local change, and we may not see it because it's the statistics will say, I'm not sure yet. A thing like this, right? We see a slightly worsening, but then we don't know about this one or that one. We see this is diffuse, and the diffuse disappears, so probably not real, but it confuses statistics. So here we have these two indices. They come from the defect curve. One is the DD, the diffuse defect, which is just the diffuse loss, and then the LD, the local defect, is just a rest, which is not diffuse. So we take defects apart into a diffuse and a local component, and then we track them across time. And here, interpretation again is like before, quite straightforward. Do I have diffuse progression, DD, diffuse defect progression? I have a red arrow down. Yes, I do. Do I have local worsening, LD, local defect progression? I have a red arrow down, so yes, I do. So then I know, okay, my cataract is getting worse, my glaucoma is getting worse. And that's quite nice. We do have, for historic reason, an SLV progression too. I tend not to look at it because this is more the homogeneity or inhomogeneity of the fields, and it gets confused if you have both local and diffuse loss progressing. But for historic reason, this is there because the SLV is the much older index. But this I find quite helpful in cases like this. Or as I said, if you have this huge amount of fluctuation, if you have the same here in the DD, right, and you can see visually, this is really just diffuse change, then if you get rid of that and just look at local, you might actually be able to detect progression much earlier in the local defect because you get rid of a bit of that patient subjectivity fluctuation. So that's nice and helpful too. And again, the LD, SLV, sometimes it picks up the same, sometimes it doesn't. So I tend not to look at this. Then it may also be interesting to know where does the change happen, cluster change, and where to look for structural change.
There's one question just popped up.
Yes, sure.
Are these analyses, the MD and DD, only available with EyeSuite and not with any competitor?
Well, the MD is a more universal thing, though, for example, size, the Humphrey uses another index, the VFI. LD and DD, they're unique to the Octopus. Really, and the set of analysis, that's unique to the EyeSuite. So yes. I'm just going on the cluster and the polar trend analysis are also unique to EyeSuite. Nobody else has them.
Great, thank you.
So as I explained to you before, glaucoma progression often, especially in early cases, starts locally. So it makes sense to look at local clusters. That's the cluster trend analysis. And as I explained to you before, it's actually more sensitive than MD trend analysis. It picks up change earlier. And the reason, again, is it's because it's local and not just this huge global average. But it's also better, and that's proven too in studies, it's better than the localized point-wise analysis. For example, what you have in a size GPA. Because the point-wise, while it's local, it's too much influenced by this normal patient-related fluctuation. And that's the nice thing of the clustered mean defect, because it's an average, but it's a local average. So it really gives you the best of both worlds. And there's really now 5, 6, 7 studies out there, and they all show the same thing for numbers. Offers this picks up change earlier. So obviously the finding change early is really powerful, but sometimes it's also interesting to get a bit of more help with finding out where's the change. You know, this is a real case from the Wills Eyes Hospital, Philadelphia. These patients happen. I mean, these visual fields and these patient performances, they're real. It's not so clear exactly where the defect is or how it's progressing, because there's a lot of variability, as we can see here too. And that's a nice thing about the cluster trend analysis, because it really shows you where the change from a statistical point of view really happens. There's something happening here, something in the center, and something also inferior nasally. And we kind of can see here, but it's hard. This is much easier to read. And it's also nice in these more advanced fields when we have floor effects, right? I mean, in this patient, most of the superior visual field is gone. So that makes it kind of look stable, even though it's not. And the overall trend analysis not picking anything up, even though just looking at this, there may be some progression here inferiorly. But because a large part of the MD is just not moving anymore, because of a floor effect, it's hard to see. And here again, a cluster analysis is really helpful, because it tells you, well, these areas of the field are kind of gone, but you have clear progression here. And in these very advanced cases, very helpful too, and you just have the very central 10 degrees, and you can see then is there still some more progression or not? It's just stable. And then the last one, of course, we track glaucomatous change also with OCT or fundus image. So we have the polar trend analysis. And the polar trend analysis is quite similar to interpret like the normal polar analysis. But here we show point-wise worsening in red, and sometimes you have a little bit of fluctuation improvement in green. But really it's the same thing, right? Where should I look for structural change? You see these red arrows here. So clearly, let's have a look there. And here's the case, clearly progressing. fast superior paracentral progression. Polar analysis is basically pointing to question here, and so does the OCT change over just 5 years. And that's really nice, kind of confirming what you see. Pretty much at the end of the talk, let's just walk you through 2 examples, and then we have more time for questions. So here's a case of early moderate glaucoma, primary open-angle glaucoma, over 7 years. I mean, we clearly see change here just from the series. It starts with a superior nasal step. Is this progressing? I mean, it's a pretty obvious case, but yes, of course, we look at the red arrow. How fast? Not so fast, just 0.4 decibel a year. Why is there change? Clearly local. We see it right down right here. Where is the change? Mostly superiorly. And where should I look for structural precession? Well, at a 6 to 8 o'clock position, where we see a large progression on the fundus picture that we have here. A second case, and for illustration and learning, I took pretty straightforward cases. Again, a patient progressing over a period of 5 years. Is it real change? Yes, it is. Red arrow here. How fast is the change? It's fairly fast. It's 1 decibel per year. Is it local or diffuse? Well, it's local. That's just a red arrow here. Where is it? And we have the superior part here, and then the central parts. And where should I look for the structural change? Clearly it says here inferior temporally or superior temporally. And we find that again, the OCT result. And you see, like within a couple of 10 seconds, you can really make a very informed decision about what kind of change is happening with your visual field series. So let's just sum this up, what the EyeSuite progression analysis gives you. And a lot of this is really unique to the EyeSuite. So obviously it gives you a series just to see where you are, defect, location, and depth. It gives you an overall trend. Is this real change or just fluctuation? But it really, and that's unique to the EyeSuite, it answers the question, do you have diffuse or local change? For example, if you have patients with overlapping visual field defects, cataract glaucoma patient, or when you have a lot of fluctuation, which is often diffuse, then you get an answer on where does the change happen with the cluster trend analysis. There's also corrected cluster trend analysis that, like the corrected comparison or corrected probabilities, it eliminates the effect of diffuse loss. And the polar trend analysis tells you where to look for structural change. I'm at the end of the talk. I hope you found this useful and learned a couple of tips and tricks, and I'm happy to answer your questions now.
Okay, so we got, thank you, Monika, that's great. We have a few questions here. So the first one is the G-top best for regular glaucoma monitoring, or do we need to do a more detailed tests in early borderline cases?
Well, there's debate on this, and I would say half of the world is using the top and half of the world is using the dynamic strategy for all their patients. And when we look at science, basically it boils down to this. So when we do pure mathematically modeling, the dynamic is a bit more accurate, and the top kind of misses local subtle defects. But then what happens is the top is much easier for patients, not only because it's shorter, but also it starts very superficial. So it's kind of reinforcing the learning on what patients are supposed to do. And it really depends on the patients. If you have this really very attentive patients, you may get slightly better results with the dynamic, but if you don't, you may actually get better results with the top. So I really can't say either or. I know very well-known clinics using top, and I know very well-known clinics using dynamic. But definitely your patients will like you if you use top. And if they perform better in the test, you actually may end up with the better results.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, we can import data from the Humphrey Field Analyzer to into EyeSuite. Is it possible to perform cluster and polar analysis on this data?
Yes, absolutely. We basically take the raw data in and recalculate everything with a Humphrey normative database. So you put your Humphrey data in your trend analysis for Octopus, you get LD, MD trend, you get cluster trend, polar trend, everything. So yes, absolutely.
Okay, thank you. And a question about is that possible to do with the HFA3 too?
Yes, we just introduced that in the latest software version, so now it is.
Okay. Excellent.
So you would, if you have an older version, you would need to upgrade.
Okay. And then there's a question it asks about the presentation that you showed. Is that available in software, or how does the clinician get the opportunity to see that?
Yes, absolutely. It's just a view in the software. We find different people like to look at different views. So there's different viewing options to choose from, but you can make this your default opening for a series. And then that's the one thing you look at always. Right. So yeah, that's part of the software, and you just open a case, you can see this.
Great. That was the end of the questions. If there's any other questions, please push them through right now. According to EyeSuite, how do you classify severity of glaucoma?
We don't really. I mean, there's been a couple of published rating systems out there. Most of them are based on include MD, SLV, or PSD. Some of them include some other indicators. We don't have an output for that because there's no consensus which one is really superior to the other.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Looks like that's the end of our questions. So I'd like to thank you very much, Monika. Appreciate it. It sounds, we have a question popping in. Oh, no, it wasn't a question. It was just thank you very much. So there you go. Thank you very much. We appreciate your time. I know it's late in Switzerland, so I won't keep you any longer. We appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for attending the webinar. Please fill out the survey on your way out so we can do this better the next time. Have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you for your time.
Thanks.
Thank you.